to be honest, what you realize that there are basically easier ways to make money if you really want to go for. Entrepreneurship and running a startup is definitely the most difficult way to go to basically create wealth. But I think that this is the most impactful and most interesting one.
Welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. Just sit back, relax, and learn from the leaders of today. It's a journey. Each one is different, unique, inspiring. Let's get started. This episode is powered by J Ventures, a community-driven VC fund in Silicon Valley, in partnership with Lacoon, sponsored by Hippo Insurance, Upwest Labs, Turing, Hillel at Stanford, Leap, and in media partnership with CTech. Welcome to another episode of 20-Minute Leaders. I'm honored to be joined today by Michael Shaulov, the CEO of Fireblocks, a secure digital asset infrastructure company. Prior to Fireblocks, he co-founded Lacoon Mobile Security, which was acquired by Check Point and was then appointed the head of products, mobile and cloud security for Check Point. Michael is a serial cybersecurity entrepreneur and investor. He is also a recognized industry speaker, delivering talks at RSA Conference, BlackHat, and Infosec. Michael Shaulov, welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Michael, for having me.
I'm really excited to have you. Your career is just fascinating, and I can't wait to hear some of the war stories that we briefly touched upon before we started here, centering around this journey and this early mid-stage journey of finding product market fit, of running a business, especially I think in the cybersecurity world. It's going to be really interesting to hear about this experience. A little bit about your background. The CEO and co-founder of Lacoon Mobile Security, previously at 8200 at Nice Systems, sold the company to Check Point, where you were heading the products of mobile and cloud security. Quite an interesting feat, but also a phenomenal investor, a seed investor in Armis and Orca, both of those very big cybersecurity names, particularly in the Israeli ecosystem, but really worldwide. And so today, the CEO of Fireblocks, which we'll get to as well. But Michael, if you look back at everything you've done, even before we go about rock climbing as a startup, what got you most excited throughout your career? If you had to look at the specific events where you were like, wow, like this is what I live for, what were some of those moments?
I think it's to build stuff. And, I was thinking about it quite a lot. Several years ago, someone asked me, why do you keep doing this, right? What sort of motivates you? And then I sort of realized that I actually don't know, right? I had to think why I'm sort of continue to engage in something that is so hard and demanding. And then I just realized that basically what I enjoy the most is sort of build things. And I think that this is a very unique, I think, aspect or property of the time that we are living in, that, if you basically learn the engineering, computer science, the fact that you can basically start, with basically zero resources or a very limited amount of resources, you can go and build things that will be used by a vast amount of people or, communities, and essentially transform. That's just fascinating. I mean, just to build something that works is fascinating, and then to build something that is actually being adopted and used is even more fascinating. I think the commercial and economic aspect of it is also interesting, but to be honest, what you realize that there are basically easier ways to make money if you really want to go for. Entrepreneurship and running a startup is definitely the most difficult way to go to basically create wealth. But I think that this is the most impactful and most interesting one.
Right. So talk to me a little bit about it. Why is it the hardest way? We briefly started talking about this idea of the struggles of finding product market fit and those getting started days. I'm particularly interested to hear about your experiences from the cybersecurity space and finding product market fit there, especially in the mobile world and the worlds that you're coming from. But what were some of those struggles like in your personal career?
So I think that actually, to go way back, right, to where my entrepreneurial career started, it's a funny story. It was actually, I think, in a high school. It's not a story that I tell a lot, but I think when we were like 10th grade or something, no, ninth grade maybe. I already knew how to sort of program in PHP and some basic website. It was sort of 98, 99 or something like that. And one of my best buddies, my best friend, he came back from Germany, and he basically told us and my friends is that that nargilas or hookahs or whatever they are being called those days, they are extremely popular in Germany, but they cost like tenfold of what they cost in Israel, where you can go to I lived in Haifa, so you can just go to Daret El Carmel, which is sort of the Druzy market over there, and buy it for 60 shekels, right? And in Europe they will cost like 60 euro or 100 euro. So we actually, when we were at 9th or 10th grade, we basically built this website which was called Go to Nargila, I think the tagline was the origin for Oriental products or something like that.
Wow.
And we were basically shipping, getting orders. It was an e-commerce site in 97 or something like that, 98, and we would get orders and we would ship those products to Europe for people that, and the United States for people that would buy them. We've done an amazing amount of mistakes back then. There is a reason why this website doesn't exist today. But also, it's sort of interesting to see how a group of sort of teenagers basically able to identify, I think, a market opportunity. And by the way, today it's actually a pretty big market, but a market opportunity that you can execute into with what back in the day was basically like our pocket money. I don't know. We probably invested 100 shekels into that project, alongside with a lot of our sweat and tears. But that was interesting for me. But what you sort of learn through this process is actually that the early days of a startup are so difficult. And sort of fast forward to Lacoon and some of the experience I had before and some of the experience I had after, is that in order for someone to basically figure out at day one some kind of triangulation of a market that is sort of untapped, that you can really build a product that has clear demand and can be really clearly positioned. And in parallel, you can basically pitch that to investors, and they will actually get it, right? And they will be willing to fund you for that journey. And the third is actually, and even today, to basically find the talent that will join you to that journey, okay, is a very difficult task that even if you basically figuring out the first aspect, it's not always trivial to figure out the second aspect. It's not always trivial to figure out the third aspect. And it sort of requires this multidisciplinary approach. And I think it's experience that basically comes through the years of, both being a really good engineer, understand how to tell the story, but also being, I think, very realistic in terms of how do you read people, how do you ask them questions, how do you ask them tough questions, so they will actually tell you the truth, because most ideas eventually fail.
Right. And so asking those for those hard truths, going back to your days as a CEO of your previous company, today you're the CEO of another company. How do you trigger those hard truths? Was it straightforward, trivial? Did you get even those hard truths when you needed them?
I think that so I'll actually sort of give you my personal experience, and unfortunately, it was an experience that I think was. I think Clara was more failures than successes. Although eventually people only count the success, right?
Right.
I think that actually even before Lacoon, I've sort of tried a few startups, and most of those startups just fail and they went nowhere. And when I started Lacoon, before I started Lacoon, we had a different startup that was called Blue Ridge. We actually raised a bit of money for it, and we sort of it was very clear from the beginning that something about that idea doesn't click, right? We would go to IT professionals and, we'll pitch them the idea and they'll say, well, look, our direction is like completely different. Although like the idea on the face of it sounds like a really cool technological breakthrough. And then I called a friend of mine. I remember I had this conversation with a friend of mine. His name is Aviv Revach. He's also a pretty known entrepreneur. He served with me in the army. And he told me, you need to read this book called 4 Steps to Epiphany. And that was really the book that sort of opened my eyes. And, essentially, this is the book that I always go back to, written by Steve Blank. But there is a very clear path over there around how do you basically do customer validation and market validation, and essentially the process of really asking those questions and sort of, I think, transcribing or understanding the answers that you're getting, right? Because inherently people always try to tell you that this is a good idea because they feel uncomfortable to tell you that it's crap and you should just go home, pack your stuff and go home, right? There's another book, by the way, that another good friend of mine told me to read. His name is Idan Plotnik, who sold his company to Microsoft. His company is called Arato. And recently he recommended me a different book that is called The Mom's Test. And basically the idea over there is that, if you ask your mom, you tell your mom, hey, mom, I'm now working on, an idea that makes my, PC mouse a popcorn machine, she will tell you that it's a great idea because you're her son, right? And as always, you're the genius, right? But most likely that it's a pretty dumb idea, right? And most people will not be as, I guess, dishonest as your mom or my mom, right? But they will fail this sort of uncomfortable situation of just telling someone that is working really hard that his idea is, in their eyes is worthless, right? By the way, Israelis are pretty good in saying that, but I think when you basically go to other cultures, especially in the United States, people are definitely trying to be very politically correct and they're very protective, right?
I believe this idea even makes a very strong appearance in one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, Outliers, where he discusses the Israeli Air Force and the culture differences, which bring on exactly what you're talking about here.
Yeah, but eventually, I think most Israeli entrepreneurs and also European entrepreneurs, they need to seek for a big market. In most cases, especially in cybersecurity, the U.S. right now is the biggest market from at least a single country. So the relying on feedback that a local feedback is actually pretty worthless, right? You really need to sort of cross the oceans. Now, going back to our experience in Lacoon, we really sort of took it to heart in terms of identifying, sort of following those guidelines. And while I don't think we sort of executed perfectly for those guidelines in terms of, actually some of the mistakes that we've done in the early stages was relying on, feedback of Israeli CISOs, which was not aligned with the feedback that we eventually got in the US market and then European market, where there were much stronger, for example, privacy concerns that we were not really aware of. To continue and follow that path, I guess somewhere around 9 months in, when we actually started to get that feedback in a much clearer voice from the US market and European market, we had to pivot, right? So pivoting is a pretty, I guess, painful process, but as long as you're able to do it early on, and especially if it's based on true feedback, I think it's quite powerful. And I think this is what basically saved us in Lacoon, right? So maybe one of the lessons learned over there was, the process is important, but also the details around the process are important. And, just go to the market where you understand that it's a big market and ask the people there, because you might have, and I've seen it over and over again, right? That you actually have sort of inconsistency in terms of how a solution or a product or a value proposition is being perceived between, across different cultures and across different markets, right?
Were you open
with Fireblocks,
to those messages that you received? So when you were receiving this, the differing messages from the U.S. market and the European market, when you're coming in and you're a leader in this company and you're basically having to decide whether to, how do you react to this new information that is practically going to make the last few months or very different from the next few months? How do you react to that?
It's very tough. I think that, by the way, it's also much tougher when you're an engineer, right? Because when you come from an engineering background, first of all, you're sort of in love with what was already built, right? And you're in love in the lines of code that were already written. And also you sort of, you know, you sort of think, well, we can build it, it will work, right? So there is a tendency to basically discard discard feedback. In a retrospective, I know that feedback was there from day one, but I think we sort of decided to, just not to react to that, and we basically were forced to react to that when we understood that there was no other option. Because at some point, I remember that we had a meeting with JP Morgan already, 9 months earlier. They basically told us that it's not going to work for them from a privacy concern. And then actually one of my investors back then reintroduced me to some people over there. And I was like, okay, how am I going to pitch them again the same idea? I'm going to, I'm going to lose face. And now it's not just me, it's just my investor is going to be there. And I was on a flight. I think I was flying to BlackHat or something like that. And I had basically, 11 hours to think about it. And then I sort of understood that we need to change how the product is basically being implemented. So it wasn't actually a pivot. Usually pivots are basically business pivot. That was actually sort of a product pivot, which is, less common. But we sort of changed the architecture that removed a lot of the issues around the privacy, and then we pitched it to JP Morgan. They were like, oh, okay, that actually makes sense, right? And then we knew that we sort of hit something that is meaningful. Interestingly enough, by the way, I've seen that multiple times. I've, as an investor, right, I've seen it with Hexadite. They did a pivot, similar pivot on the product where it, for example, what you see in cybersecurity is actually a lot of those pivots that are being done not on the business level, but actually on the product level. I've seen this in Hexadite. There is a very famous story in Armis of how they basically initially focused on physical hardware, and based on the first meaningful client that they basically got, they just understood that they cannot implement that, and they pivoted to a software-based solution, and that basically what brought them to where they are. If they were still sort of heads down going with their hardware device, unlikely that they could have even scaled to the revenue and footprint that they have those days. So it's interesting.
I think that, I can tell there's infinite more stories that we could be talking now, and I'm gaining inspiration from each of them. And I really want to thank you for coming on. 20 minutes go by way, way, way too fast. And I do have a few questions that I love asking in the end. So, Michael, are you ready for them?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, wonderful. We'll start non-committing. They seem weird, but they're a lot of fun. So we'll start off with your favorite subject in school, and I'm curious. I'm curious if I'll be surprised by this one.
Yeah, so you probably won't be surprised for the first subject that was my favorite one, which was physics, right? But actually, my second most favorite subject was more like around cinematography, right? So
Okay.
movies and things like that. That was my second most favorite subject.
What is it about cinematography that drew your attention?
I think that sort of filming and directing and the way that films are being constructed, in terms of that you actually can basically put the plot and film from different directions, which just gives a whole new perspective to the story. That was like fascinating for me in terms of how you construct and structure those things.
I love it. Okay, one of your role models throughout your life, whether it's real or fake.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that they keep changing continuously. I think that one of the most inspirational models right now for me is Bill Gates, right? Sort of tempted to say Elon Musk. That's probably like the answer that everybody giving. But I think Bill Gates is more interesting. Probably it wouldn't be my role model like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But I think that after watching the most recent documentary from Netflix, it was something very inspiring, both in terms of what he's doing right now, and honestly also in terms of how he sort of changed through his career.
I completely agree, and I think that if I look at hopefully the type of impact that I would like to have on the world, I can't imagine going to sleep better at night than knowing that I'm both able to deploy means to make a difference, but also use the brains and actual a whiteboard. I keep getting inspired by watching his own blog posts detailing the sewer system from a few years ago when he was practically leading a small team of researchers doing it. I thought it was just amazing that he's hands in picking up the pen and doing it. And the weirdest question of all, 3 words that you would choose to describe yourself.
Yeah, it's a good one. Think I think that probably first one is fearless.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is thoughtful, maybe about things. And the third one is actually contradictory. So I think that there are aspects in me that are very impulsive.
Okay, fearless, thoughtful, and impulsive. I love it. Michael, thank you very, very much. Please book a time in your calendar with me so that we can do a few more episodes, because it's just, I know that there are so many more stories that I haven't even begun to extract from you. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Thank you for the inspiration and for the honesty about your journey. I think it's just amazing, and continue making a huge positive impact. We didn't even get to start talking about the company that you're now running. So that'll wait for next time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. Take care.